everyone, and welcome to this next episode from the RICS Tech Partner Program. My name's Andrew Knight. I've been with RICS for nearly 11 years now, and I currently sit in the standards, regulation and thought leadership part of the organisation with a role to look at the whole effect of data and technology right across the built environment and how that affects our profession and our members. RICS has over 130,000 members worldwide, working right across the property life cycle, working across residential, commercial, infrastructure, alternative assets. So an incredibly wide canvas for the application of data and technology. And a key part of that is our Tech Partner Program. And I'm really happy today to be talking to Giles and David from Avvoka. So Giles and David, please join me.
Hi there, Andrew.
Hi, Andrew.
Welcome both. Glad to have you on board today. The first thing I always ask, and it's slightly intrusive, I suppose, to some extent, is I'm always interested to hear about the background of the people behind data and technology, because ultimately this is a people business, and data and technology still has to be developed and delivered by people. So I'd be really keen to hear a bit of a backstory about both of you, Giles and David. So maybe Giles, lead in with your backstory and a bit of a background to why you started Avvoka and the kind of skills your team has.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the sort of origin story of Avvoka, the origin story is probably most linked to David, seeing as he's the founder on the call. But I'm very happy to sort of talk to my role and sort of why I joined, and also some maybe my personal interface I have with RICS as well. So my background is I'm from Norfolk, the son of a farmer, and an RICS member as well, so a chartered surveyor and someone who worked in commercial property in London at one stage. So I've sort of been brainwashed from a young age into the virtues of the RICS. But yeah, my professional background is that I qualified as a lawyer in the city. I worked at Herbert Smith Freehills, and I actually spent some time there working in real estate finance at one stage, and so interacting with lots of different types of people who have that interface with RICS in loads of different professional capacities. Then I qualified and worked at Kirkland & Ellis, and I was a patent litigator and working on technical patents in particular. And really the impetus for me joining David's ship, which was already sort of forging ahead, was that I was working on quite a lot of the administrative side of the law. So I was deleting a lot of square brackets, and I was doing a lot of repetitive process type work. And when I signed up to be a lawyer, I wanted to be adding, analysis and sort of bespoke advice, and empathizing is the main part of my job. And look, I got an opportunity to do that. That was probably 25% of the work I was doing, but it wasn't nearly enough for me. I wanted to do sort of more of that sort of, I guess, real lawyering. And so that's my background. And I think we got in touch really, Andrew, initially because contracts aren't just for lawyers. They're really mainly for the people who are doing business.
Exactly.
So, I've seen my father's background involved with the RICS, but I know how diverse the group is, and actually that a lot of what they do is adding value, but actually contracts are almost a lot of the time seen as a bit of a formality that sits behind that, and the sort of work and the due diligence that goes behind them is really the sort of important bit.
Indeed, thanks. So David, what's your background? And as Giles said, you're the man responsible for the creation of Avvoka.
Well, I'm certainly one half of it with my co-founder Elliot. But yeah, unfortunately, you're joined by two ex-lawyers on the call today, so don't hold it against us. So yeah, I was at a firm called Linklaters for a couple of years is where I trained. Standard story, left university, wanted to be a lawyer. Went and worked there for a couple of years, and really as I was working there, and Elliot had a very similar career path at Slaughter and May. We just spent a huge amount of our time, as Giles has mentioned, doing work which was very high value, but actually, to be honest, took a long time to do things that really shouldn't take that long, and a lot of stuff should be automated. There should be massive efficiency brought to the whole industry. Everyone's got their own stories, but I particularly remember when I was on secondment in Hong Kong, thinking I was living the dream, being there till 3 a.m, changing the middle initial on a director's 300 signature pages, and I was really close to wondering what on earth is going wrong. So that, I think that the whole industry is great, but as you say, ultimately, Giles, as you mentioned, contracts are there to help business get done, and the quicker we can all do that, the better. And ultimately, we started Avvoka because what we wanted to do was create a tool really that just helped speed along that efficiency. If we can make documents quicker and contracts quicker, ultimately business gets done quicker. Legal costs can be more reasonable for certain people, in different sectors of the society. So ultimately, we just want to bring efficiency to what is still a very important part of everyone's process, but can be done a little bit quicker and more efficiently. And that's what we did 5 years ago now, which seems like a huge amount of time, but in some ways, no time at all.
Thanks, David. I suppose what's interesting is that, and I must say, I'm not a great fan of the phrase prop tech, which will probably condemn me with many of my peers, but I find it kind of sort of limiting in some respects, because I suppose arguably people might call what you're doing law tech to an extent, which is another term I'm not a great fan of. But I guess for me, it's interesting that it's worth thinking about the effect and the benefit of data and technology more widely across real estate, because it is a blurred area where sometimes you're talking about law tech effectively, or fintech or prop tech, and really it's just where can we apply technology and how does it help. And I suppose another cliche that's perhaps come out of the kind of the prop techy world is the danger of almost building a solution looking for a problem. And I guess what would be interesting to hear would be for both of you to perhaps kind of build on what is the problem you're actually solving, because you've talked about removing square brackets and removing initials, but really what's the crux of the problem in terms of what people aren't able to do at the moment without some lawyer sitting there up until the middle of the night when they should be in a bar in Hong Kong enjoying life. So what's the fundamental problem that you're solving? Why are people still spending time doing that sort of stuff?
Yeah, and I think first of all, just Andrew, I couldn't agree more about your idea of prop tech, legal tech, fintech. Those definitions I think make it quite difficult for people, because actually legal tech is legal tech until it's applied in property, in which it becomes prop tech. Yeah. Until it's applied in the finance world, it becomes fintech. And actually, one of our very first clients was Countrywide, and we spent our first early years actually helping generate residential tenant and landlord letters. And we were called a prop tech for that time. So I first of all, I just think you're completely right that ultimately I think technology ultimately has to have a label, but it ultimately depends on the actual application of it. And I think that can be a danger, because it puts people off looking at legal tech, because it's not for me. But actually it just deals with contracts. So just on that point, couldn't agree more. In terms of the problem we're actually trying to solve, though, I think that the real key is that, I think as Giles very well kind of mentioned, that ultimately lawyers and legal professionals, their skill set lies in the unique, or in the advice, or in the difficulty of that particular situation. They're not necessarily needed to create the first draft of that formulaic document. So say for now, you're leasing a residential property, there are, model commercial leases, there are documents that actually are out there, for example, that they're standard form, there are the same clauses that should drop in depending on the rough type of deal. Now, there will always be extras that need to be tailored for that specific deal, that commercial reality, that situation. But that first bit of getting it to, that first draft, which is a good starting point, just can take so much time. So the typical process would be you'd have your precedent document online or from an institution, you download it, and then you would spend the next few hours or 10 hours going through and deleting all the different bits of that document that don't, aren't relevant for that particular deal. And I think, so what we allow you to do essentially is turn that document into an initial questionnaire. So you answer the questions, then what you get out of it is a really great first draft, because I've ticked a box that says I'm doing this type of property. I've ticked a box that says it's located in Scotland, and I've got that document that is fit for that situation. But then the real work starts, which is me going, well, actually, I know the client wants this and the relationship means that, and I go and tweak it. So it's that, how can we remove the formulaic aspect of every process and then leave people with the expertise to do the things that they're really good at?
Well, I guess it's that classic 80-20 rule, that you can do the 80% stuff really quickly, automate that, and then the real added value for the lawyer is that 20% of tweaking, special clauses, things that are quite contract specific, but that basic heads of agreement or heads of terms is pretty formulaic, and as you say, is kind of automated to the extent that there are various options. So I mean, I guess, would you effectively call this sort of contract automation? Is it a way of effectively automating that first stage of creation of contracts, whatever the context is?
Absolutely, yeah, spot on. Yeah, we call it document automation, contract automation. Yeah, it's the automation of that production of first draft. Now we do have other aspects around the negotiation, the data, but that all kind of flows really from let's get that document ready as quickly as possible, as efficiently as possible, and help business get done essentially.
So how does it actually work? So if I came to you and said, look, this sounds great, we're spending a lot of time on leases or loan documents, whatever it is, what's the process of actually, is it almost one size fits all for a particular type, or do you work with the client to say, look, let's look at your standard heads of terms for these kind of documents? How does it actually work in the real world?
Yeah, I can definitely describe that. The first thing to say that is that contract or document automation technology, at least our version of this anyway, is totally agnostic as to what document or contract you're trying to automate.
Okay.
So, we work for the likes of Booking.com, McDonald's, Baker McKenzie, Allen & Overy, HSBC, Omnipresent, loads of different, firms, and they are both sort of professional advisors. So people like Allen & Overy, but on the other side, big international conglomerates like, Warner Media or Booking.com. And so the way that they get set up on the system is exactly the same as one another. And that is by taking a standard form contract or document, uploading it to the online system, and then intuitively going through that document and highlighting the bits which are sort of what we call placeholder information. So things like the company name, the company address, all that, boring kind of boilerplate stuff, highlighting that, and then basically saying that should be populated by some information that's typed in by the user. Separately, the next thing that people do is they highlight the parts of that document or contract which are sort of conditional, so which might be included in some versions and which might not be included in others. So, for example, maybe an automatic renewal of some kind of agreement. You might have that in some contracts, depending on what you've negotiated commercially. You might not in others. Obviously, there's loads of different aspects as well. A classic one that I dealt with in practice was property management agreements. So, there would always be a discussion about what, that. And there are lots of obviously high-profile property managers. I won't name one. I won't play favorites. But what sort of different schedules they would have on the agreement and what they would be covering for the client. And then after that designation process, the output of that is just a questionnaire. And that questionnaire is then designed for the end user. So you might have your commercial letting negotiator. You might have your sort of project management, lead, be the person who's negotiating that and supplying that information in the first instance. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavor, Andrew, of how this works. And, I could talk about, the fact that this preserves data, and also I could talk about the fact that this doesn't just work on a one contract basis. You can have multiple contracts that link and talk to each other so that, you're not just getting this saving or process applied to one contract, but the whole sort of process of different contracts and documents are all linked together and are all nicely created by that questionnaire. And frankly, the end user won't even know that's all happening in the background.
That sounds good. I mean, are there any barriers, either real or perceived, kind of to moving to this type of approach? I mean, sometimes it can be, dare I say it, behavioral issues as much as technical issues that can perhaps put people off this kind of technology. What kind of conversations are you having where people are perhaps raising objections or thinking that, quote, this isn't for them or it wouldn't work for us, quote unquote? What sort of conversations are you having in that kind of vein?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Andrew. I think issues are often more behavioural than they are in technology, and I think actually it's been there for a while. I think people will be staggered to actually see what type of technology is out there at the moment that can be used in their day-to-day jobs, and I mean that in a sense of people. Technology can do genuinely amazing things in the software world of all types of jobs, and it actually has been able to be done for a while. The problem is just either the internal infrastructures at different teams, or again, it's behavioural shift. It's people being concerned that perhaps the technology is going to be either replace their job or it's going to be difficult for them to use and learn and adapt. But actually, I really don't think, I can honestly speak, very truthfully, I think that most technology really isn't out there to disrupt in a way that a whole profession isn't needed. It's genuinely there to aid. I look at our example. I know for a fact, me as my junior lawyer at 3 in the morning in Hong Kong would have loved to have not been needed for those extra 2 hours. You know, you can outsource those 2 hours and replace them with technology all you want. You know, and I think really a lot of the technology is there to remove the stuff that people don't ultimately want to do, because the things that people are good at, it's impossible to do automatically. You know, maybe in the future we'll have this all amazing AI that can do everything for us, but until that point, you know, it's really, really difficult to automatically do the part of the job that what we as professionals in all our industries are best at. And I think once you appreciate that, and you can see that technology might well be changing the way you do things slightly, it definitely will probably need a bit of a readjustment to your learning pattern, but the end results can be enormous. So I think behavioral shift is huge. I think particularly in certain industries, people have done the same thing the same way for huge amounts of years. I think it's very easy for people to sit there having had quite successful careers in very successful companies, thinking they don't need to change and adapt because, well, you know, why would I? I once heard someone say that, you know, going into a room of kind of law firm partners and say you should use technology is like telling them they've been doing things wrong for the last 20 years.
Yeah.
Because in some ways, I think we're a product, you know, the fault of the fact the systems work well enough at the moment that sometimes technology isn't actually, it's not that need, you know, they're like, well, it does work. So yeah, I think on the short, behavioral is an issue, but that is changing. I think people are more open to it. I think weirdly, actually, the pandemic in a way, you know, has helped that to some extent, because I'm sure in the same for you, Andrew, and people at your organisation, we've all been thrust into a world of working from home and using technology we didn't have to use a year ago. And people are now who would always be, you know, go to their desk and use their desktop every day, and now being forced to use Zoom, conferencing calls, you know, laptops. So attitudes are changing slightly, but I think that's the biggest hurdle, to try and prove value rather than necessarily being the kind of tech itself.
Indeed,
I don't know, Giles, you know, you're on the, you know, speaking to a lot of people day in, day out as well. I'm not sure if you.
Yeah, Giles, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think there's a big point. You know, I think I agree with David when he says it works quite well at the moment, and I say quite. You know, a lot of commercial negotiators who are members of the RICS, or who are, you know, otherwise doing professional services, that they basically become sort of makeshift contract lawyers. So, you know, they're good at kind of going through this process themselves. In addition, a lot of the people listening to this session will have excellent legal advisors, and so they don't know the difference. They're receiving a great quality of service, and they're getting their contracts pretty damn fast, even though it's not automated. And I think that's a credit to the lawyers who are delivering that level of service. But what I would say is they don't know how good it can be. You know, we have certain clients who will generate, you know, 200-page complex loan facilities and that kind of thing by going onto an online portal at sort of 3 in the morning, filling out a few basic questions, and then they generate that in their own time. So you've got all of these kind of other benefits which are sitting in there, which they haven't necessarily appreciated, or maybe they're not even incentivized in the short term to look for. So, for example, the accessibility of data within your particular contracts. You know, it's only a sort of year after you conclude a deal that you realize, actually, hang on, like, it would be quite useful for me to be able to sort of automatically generate the same agreement twice, but with one particular element of it different, or to report to my client on absolutely all of the key deal terms in an Excel sheet. Or for example, you know, we didn't get sued because the standard version of our contract was what we used, and we didn't even have to think about it, and all of those key terms were in there. And you know what? Oh, you know, I actually filled that in at 4 p.m. every time, but actually I could have done it at 3 in the morning, and I could have had it then and there. And you know, I didn't end up ruining my private practice lawyer's weekend, and they like me more. And actually, perhaps we've got freed up budget with our private practice lawyer to actually ask them the material questions and have them sit in on our negotiations on a call, rather than deleting square brackets. So I think it's a lot of the benefits that people don't necessarily see, because I don't think a lot of the time that the time efficiency benefit everybody appreciates as much as they necessarily should. And I think, relatedly, Andrew, that's to do with the fact that there is a time cost associated with setting up automation. Now, there's a very, very quick payoff period after that, but you know, everybody here is extremely busy, and frankly, the people who get the most out of the system are the most busy. So it's a bit of a catch-22.
Yeah.
And we've sought to actually rectify that. So with the Loan Market Association, who a number of your members will be very, very aware of, we've actually done a partnership, and we've launched a platform called LMA Automate with them and with Allen & Overy. And we've actually pre-automated the standard form Loan Market Association documents, and we're making those available as sort of a package that people can buy. So they can kind of bypass that initial setup phase.
Yeah.
And actually, we're looking to do that in areas where our RICS members will benefit. So if anybody's listening to this thinking, gosh, that really applies to me, let us know, because ultimately, if we can do that work centrally, we can work together to do that. Then we can deliver this so much quicker and so much more conveniently to the people who would benefit.
Yeah, thanks, Giles. No, I suppose, and it raises an interesting point there, which is a particular bugbear of mine, that the whole kind of sector, not just the legal sector, but more broadly, is sort of still thinking about documents rather than having structured data and thinking, well, actually, ultimately, we do need to analyze, and because documents are really just an output of a structured decision-making process, and people are forever trying to trawl through hard copy leases effectively, or hard copy agreements, to try and work out logically what's going on or what went wrong, rather than saying, well, we should have this available, yes, as a document, as a piece of output that needs to be signed, but that at the same time we need to analyze the structure of these, and hence all the activity that's had to take place to try and abstract leases for IFRS 16 and those kind of issues. So it is a kind of I think a broader problem of so much data in real estate being held in documents which you can't really interrogate and have no structure above and beyond being a Word document or a PDF. So I guess moving on to RICS specifically, and I suppose that there's a couple of things here I'd like to kind of discuss. One of which is, I suppose, a broader point about RICS members with so many working in smaller firms, is how this technology can be accessible for the smaller practices. And I appreciate your point about, there's that upfront work required, but also your views, I guess, on where you see where RICS members are looking at contracts. Where should they be just adding value? Where genuinely are they adding value? And where do you think perhaps property professionals are a bit like lawyers, simply removing square brackets and doing that kind of low-level stuff? Because I think, to pick up on David's point, it is about highlighting that technology is augmenting people's roles, not replacing them. It's actually enabling them to go up the value chain, to use the horrible business jargon. So, sorry, quite a few questions bundled in there for the pair of you.
Yeah, and I think the first caveat I'll make in this response is the people listening to this, they already know best. I can definitely sort of throw some ideas out there, but everybody listening to this knows the thing which drives them mad every time that they have to do it, and they know the thing that costs them 4 or 5 days at the beginning of or just before closing on transactions that they deal with. So I think it's generally quite obvious to people. I think the bit which is perhaps less obvious is what the sort of sweet spot is in terms of a document. So something like an NDA, if you're doing one NDA every year, it's probably not destroying your internal efficiency and data collection doing that on a manual basis. If you're having to execute 5 of those every day, maybe it is. Similarly, if you're doing a really, really complex agreement, once a year, that there's a bit more preparation time to set up the automation, assuming you're doing it yourself. So it's perhaps not worth it. Where you've got that kind of mid-level, where you're doing something with relatively high frequency and it's relatively complicated, it takes you maybe it's one of those tasks where you have to block out your diary to get it done. Those are the perfect items to automate. So I think engagement arrangements. I think that's a really, really obvious one, and I think that will apply to anybody who's listening to who's dispensing professional advice. I think another really obvious one is letters of intent, term sheets, that kind of thing, because there's a lot of information in there, but they're really, really structured. And actually, I think they're one of the best examples, because you can take advantage of related document functionality. And that's something that I'm using the term that we use in Avvoka, but it's something that's you can see in other platforms as well. And so here's an idea. So you automate your letter of intent, your term sheet, and then what you can do is, once that's completed, you can have a process that's set up in the background to automatically create the first version of your property management agreement or your your purchase agreement for property, or whatever it might be, or the lease. So I think that's a really good example where actually that letter of intent, that term sheet, can create that sort of headline document. But actually, depending on the way that that's been set up, maybe there are other professional advisors who are going to be brought into the deal. Maybe there's some sort of guarantee agreement that's being created as part of the deal as well. And also the property management agreement, the number of schedules it has, all of those kinds of things are probably stored within that initial term sheet, and all those other documents can be sort of kicked off without a project manager within your team having to sort of sit there and think too hard about it. Similarly, with an engagement, maybe if it's a particular type of corporate, you need to do some additional compliance forms, tax forms, onboarding forms, AML, know your customer. You get the idea.
Yeah.
It's sort of where there's that process which takes a bit of time, but actually you're doing enough of them to really justify automating that whole process. So I hope that answers your question, Andrew.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, David, any thoughts on those same topics?
Yeah, I think again with Giles, I'd kind of say, talk about, how do we spot the opportunities? I think, almost any document can be automated, any process can be automated. I think, if you're sat there doing something repetitively, and if you ever find yourself thinking there has to be a better way than doing this, then there probably is. I think is the truth now. I think we're in such a great time that people are out there innovating in all different types of areas. If you find yourself doing any part of your job that feels repetitive and you can almost do it on autopilot, then there's a chance that there's a tool out there that can help you do it on autopilot. And again, it's about spotting those opportunities. And I think the other thing is, when you have spotted them, it's trying to be brave, or just trying something. I think often, and I've worked at a big organization, I completely remember what it was like, but people often, I think, want to get something perfect, and they want the new process to do absolutely everything, and maybe make a cup of tea for them at the same time. But actually, I think we all have to kind of maybe realize that actually 50% quicker is very good, and right, it might not be able to do this and this, but actually at the moment you can't do it either. And I think actually sometimes when we look into implementing technology, we're trying to look for the perfect, and if something's not perfect, or not every part of that process is perfectly changed for you, there's no point doing it. So I think that's maybe kind of the wrong answer to your question, but in a way, it's just when we're thinking about these things, I would really encourage people just to have a go at things, whether it's document automation, whether it's kind of automated KYC checks, whether it's anything at all. You'd be surprised how quickly a lot of this new technology can be up and running and tryable in a couple of weeks. And within a 6-week period, I always think you can test something and fail. I remember I was speaking to a law firm once, and they had this innovation committee, and they had spent 6 months getting consultants to come in and analyze 20 different pieces of technology before they were picking, a few to try. They'd have spent £100,000 probably consulting on the technology, picking them before trying them. They could have tried half of them for probably a third of the budget in 2 months and come to a concrete conclusion. So I think, as you both said, it's as much as us trying to help make people think about it, but once you have identified something that might be fixable, I would say just give it a go, because you've really got nothing to lose.
Yeah, and I'm presuming you're offering this platform as software as a service, so it's pretty easy just to trial it and try out a few document cases. So and as you say, I think it's back to that 80-20 point, that in the same way that there's very clever machine learning looking to abstract lease terms, it can't do it all. You still need the human element, and no product is probably going to automate anything 100%. So I think being realistic, that even if you saw, as you say, a 50% efficiency gain, that's still a huge gain, and that don't let perfection be the enemy of the good, if I've got the right phrase there. So
absolutely.
One last thing perhaps to think about, we've kind of talked about briefly that sort of the ability that actually by doing this you're turning it slightly into data. Can you talk me through some examples where that sort of more data-led approach, where actually, because you've automated the form, you've turned it more into a kind of a data structure that then is populated and has that sort of logical flow? Because it's one of the things, as I say, I continue to kind of talk about, is this move away from documents to data, to get more structure about the data that people build into documents, because that fundamentally is expressing the relationship they have with a client or a building, or the attributes of a building or the attributes of a lease. So I'd be interested to hear about any kind of almost case studies where people have begun to analyze the data as a result of using this more automated document creation.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be very happy to address that one, Andrew. And look, yeah, I think before I do, I just think it's the key thing to say here is, this is about, not having to pester your lawyers unless there's actually a legal question or something kind of material to discuss. And it's also about getting you out of the office quicker, and it's about making process less of a headache and freeing up headspace. That being said, so that's kind of like, that is solving the pain, but there is some really quite serious commercial advantages that this can gain people. Now, I believe you as well, Andrew, hate talking about data in a vacuum. Everyone talks about data. And it's like, what does it mean? Are we doing big data? Are we doing machine learning? Are we doing AI? It's hard to keep track. And so I like to talk about it in really concrete ways. Now, if you're a professional advisor and you're working on leases and you're advising people on what terms they should be agreeing and what they shouldn't be agreeing, and helping negotiations, what is the most useful thing that you can have in your negotiation and advice toolkit? Well, it's what's market. It's what's been agreed previously. It's also, to an extent, what that client's personal preferences are and what they've agreed to, in the past, what their red lines are. Now, wouldn't it be great if we could have all of that information in a readily accessible database, and to jump in and, for example, see on a particular type of clause in a lease what your client has agreed before, and perhaps what a particular counterparty has pushed back with it in a previous instance. Well, by using contract automation and our negotiation platform, you can track all of that information and you can access it anytime. So if you're on the phone to your client, they ring you up and say, gosh, this counterparty is a nightmare, aren't they? I just want this term, and I just don't know how we're going to get around to it. Aren't they stubborn? You can open up your platform, open it up and say, actually, that deal we did 2 years ago with these guys on a separate property, well, they agreed to this, and we can point that out to them. So that, for me, I think that's a very, very powerful device for people. Similarly, and a little bit more banal, you've invoiced the client, okay, or perhaps your lawyers, you're not speaking to them, and engaging with them as regularly as you had been, but maybe the end owner of whatever property you're dealing with has asked you a question and said, what did we agree in this agreement 5 years ago? You've had your invoice paid. You're probably not. It's going to be awkward to try and invoice for that particular query. Well, if you can jump in and see and extract all of the key commercial terms and putting it in a nice Word document or PDF for them and flick it through to them in about 5 seconds, wouldn't that be a helpful thing? And wouldn't that, free up some resource and some dead time which you can't invoice for? So that's the kind of stuff that Avvoka is able to help with. And actually, just take it one level further, you can also start to build an asset. So if you have particular standard form agreements that you have, and you notice that a particular point is always getting marked up, what you can do is you can then go in and amend your standard form contract. Or if you're engaging people and you find that every person you're engaging is pushing back on 3 particular terms, you're not going to win them. So why don't you change those terms going forward, and then that process becomes smoother. And actually, one thing that's I think quite funny that we've noticed in some of our client contracts is sometimes there's a comma or a missing full stop or a misspelt word in people's contract, which actually holds up the sales process by a third. I'm thinking of one particular example here. You can find little things like that which are actually, really, killing your lockup period or your client conversion process, and fix those. And I should, it's not funny because it's actually quite a serious commercial consequence. But it's just one of those insights you don't necessarily think about when you adopt a tool like this.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that example around sort of being able to look at clauses and whether a client signed that up in the past, because I was talking to a tech partner in the US recently, and they're taking a different approach in the sense they're sort of looking at existing documents and analysing them to work out what the clauses are, but they're doing it almost the other end of the telescope. They're looking at huge global infrastructure deals, but they're looking at the terms with the various stakeholders, governments, various people, and saying, actually, well, in a particular kind of infrastructure project, what are the common terms? Would a certain country accept that term and not that one? And did they accept it 5 years ago? Therefore, you should be able to enforce it this time because they were happy to do it 5 years ago. So it's that similar echo of building a history of which clauses apply to which contracts and all that sort of stuff. David, any thoughts on that topic as well?
Yeah, and I was going to say actually, it's quite interesting that right now so much of the focus, I'm sure, Andrew, you feel this very acutely as well, is we are looking at that historic data. But it's quite funny, in some ways, it always feels to me like we're trying to solve it sometimes in the wrong way, because every single day we produce a contract that becomes a copy-stained PDF scan. We're giving ourselves a problem 3 years from now or 4 years from now, and actually, I would like to think that actually, if we can start creating contracts in a more data sensible way, then actually we don't need to. And I'm sure these tools are going to great other things in a different lens, and there'll always be legacy contracts. But just in terms of conceptually, it almost feels like we're spending so much time trying to solve that historic data problem without thinking about the fact that every day we're adding more documents to that file. And the great irony is that the second you sign that contract, everything there is in that contract. You know what the term is, what the clauses are, what the break fees are, that the very second you sign it. Yet after that, you forget all about it. It goes in a drawer and you lose it. And then when you actually need it, you don't have that knowledge. The great irony is your best place to know what a contract is the second you sign it and the second you leave it. So actually, I think, if we can just maybe think about it in a slightly different way, that we realize that we're making problems for ourselves 2 years from now. Maybe that's another way. I think, Andrew, you asked before about how do we help incentivize people or that behavioral shift. I think it's different people in the organization can be swayed by different things. So maybe me as my junior self was, I want to get out of the office quicker, but actually probably my boss at the time, or my superiors were probably thinking, actually, if I could automate something, the efficiency is great, but actually what I really care about is that 2 years from now, if there's a crisis, or I want to know whether virus is covered in my force majeure clause, for example, I can click a button and it brings it up. And I think if we can get people almost planning ahead and looking backwards, then that can also kind of move the needle. But fascinating area. And I think contract data is only going to go from strength to strength as technology gets better and we get more involved in it.
Perhaps the rude way of putting it would be, if you're in a hole, stop digging. So start automating now. Sorry, Giles. A final thought from you before we close, Giles.
Yeah, Andrew. I was just gonna bring another buzzword into the conversation, which is or buzz phrase, which is ESG. Now, I think we're all broadly here in the same generation, but certainly my younger siblings' generation, when they invest in property, and ultimately they're where a lot of this money is originally coming from, they're looking at ESG credentials. Now, I'm no expert on this in the context of property, but I know that this is a huge trend in the market, and everybody is worried about being seen to be ESG compliant, both for ethical but also for business reasons. Now, that's another benefit of this kind of data. If in a few years' time you can more easily report on the contents of your deals, that means that potentially you have more stuff which can qualify for various different ESG credentials or schemes, instead of maybe not finding those deals, or and figuring out that they can be packaged and sold in a particular way. So that's a real business cost that I think is going to become bigger and bigger for people. And I think the other point around sort of stopping digging is, I don't really care necessarily what we agreed in a lease 10 years ago. What I really care about is what was agreed maybe 6 months ago, 3 weeks ago, 3 months ago, because that inherently is going to be more relevant data than the stuff which happened 10 years ago. So actually, to a certain degree, inherently that process of going and then post hoc analyzing data means that you're never ever getting the most relevant insight as well.
Indeed. No, you're very right to highlight that whole ESG thing. As you know, there's green leases now, there's clauses coming in that are going to be really important. Well, it's been a fascinating conversation. Thanks to both of you, David and Giles, and I look forward to our next event, probably maybe a panel session, a broader discussion with some other industry stakeholders. But it's been great to talk, and I look forward to talking again. So thanks again.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Andrew. It's been great.
Pleasure.
Thanks, Andrew.